Hello, this is Helen Dexter, course convener of PL7505 International Security, and this short podcast relates to week 5 of our module, which is on state sovereignty and intervention. A short podcast on humanitarian intervention is actually a really difficult thing to do because really, where do you start with this topic? And it seems that every time I come to teach a class on humanitarian intervention, I start by saying, this is a particularly timely subject matter. And this week is no different. The war on terror was supposed to have signalled the death of humanitarian intervention due to the backlash that was seen to military operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. But since then, we've witnessed the apparent victory of the responsibility to protect doctrine in the intervention in Libya. That was quite a short-lived victory because then the failure of any kind of formal intervention in Syria was argued by some to have signalled the death of the responsibility to protect. And then obviously we've seen recently Russia's annexing of Crimea. But this week in particular, we're discussing humanitarian intervention in the shadows of the 20th anniversary of the Rwandan genocide. The Rwanda genocide is, of course, the intervention that never was. This was a crisis of immense proportions that the world turned away from, and the West's failure to act is viewed now as a moral scar. It comes as no surprise then that media coverage of the genocide's anniversary, in the UK at least, is focusing on the failure of the West to support Romeo Dulaire's calls for troops. The Rwanda question, as I refer to it, is now a key element in debates about the role of military force and whether it can be used in a humanitarian role. So the Rwanda question goes like this. Faced with a situation like Rwanda, would you intervene or not? And I have to say that every time I've made a presentation or given a lecture where I raise questions about the morality or the utility of armed force, this is the question that I get asked. Faced with a situation like Rwanda, would you use military force to intervene or not? Now, to my mind, the Rwanda question functions in a very similar way to the ticking time bomb scenario. So I'm sure you're familiar with the ticking time bomb scenario, but it goes like this. There's a bomb somewhere in central London. You have in your custody a terrorist who knows the location, but he won't tell you where it is. Do you torture to get the information or not? Now, the problem with the ticking time bomb scenario is that so much has to be assumed that the situation becomes simply fanciful. It's a situation that bears very little resemblance to the reality of counter-terrorism, and yet the question is phrased in such a way that there is a moral weight, moral responsibility to act, and it makes it very difficult in this hypothetical to argue against torture. Now, I think that the Rwanda question functions in a similar way to this ticking time bomb scenario. So it focuses attention on a crisis situation where you have to make a moral decision, diverting attention away from broader questions and the long-term picture. So what's interesting is, how do we possibly get to a situation where this is our only choice, to torture or not to torture, to intervene with military force or not to intervene at all? I think the question, would you intervene, as well, also suggests that you are in some way a neutral bystander, that you haven't already intervened in some way. So this particular question and the way in which discussions about Rwanda tend to be framed, what interests me is what alternatives are being foreclosed by always focusing on this one crisis situation, this one question. And what questions could we ask were we to frame the discussion in a different way? So this week, well, with every week really, I'm going to encourage you to think about the different questions that we might ask about this topic. So have a read through the media coverage of the 20th anniversary of the genocide. Think about how it's being framed, and then ask yourself, are there other questions that we could be asking?